Started, if that's all right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am Marshall Cunningham. I am the Associate Coordinator of Craft Teaching. Welcome to our final event of the year, to be followed by a wine reception with snacks, so don't forget that. Our final workshop this year is titled Navigating Normativity, Pedagogical Challenges and Opportunities of Diverse Commitments in the Classroom, and we're happy to be co-hosting this with the Theology and Religious Ethics workshop. So those of you who are there from the workshops, welcome. Not much to announce since it's the end of the year, but if you have not taken a look at our blog yet, please do so. You can find the link through our Divinity School webpage. We have 5 recent graduates, new junior faculty members who have been discussing a whole host of issues relevant to being a junior faculty member. And it's been pretty engaging so far this quarter. So if you're looking for some light reading while you're procrastinating your papers, it's a good place to go. And that's about all I have. So I will introduce our illustrious panel. 2 of 3 are here already, and the 3rd is en route. So I'll begin with Professor Valerie Johnson from DePaul University. She's an associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at DePaul. Her research focuses on urban politics, African American politics, and urban education. Professor Jonathan Ebel. Man, never wouldn't have gotten it in 40 tries. So I apologize. Professor Ebel from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He's the director of graduate studies and an associate professor in the Department of Religion. His research program involves religion and war, religion and violence, lay theologies of economic hardship, all within the American context. He is a graduate of this prestigious institution, PhD in 2004. Professor Laurie Zoloth, who is currently on Lakeshore Drive and will be joining us as soon as she can, is a professor of religious studies, a professor of bioethics and medical humanities at the Feinberg School of Medicine, and director of graduate studies at Northwestern University's Department of Religious Studies. She's the co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's section on women and religion, and she is a member of the Society for Scriptural Reasoning. She's been a member of the NASA National Advisory Council. Professor Valerie Johnson is going to start.
Okay, and please feel free to cut me off. I have a tendency to be a little long-winded.
It's okay, you might be talking for Professor Zoloth today.
Okay. Let me see if I could pull up my...
There's a little button on the remote control that says blank. If you push that, it can wake it up.
Also, please sign in if you haven't already.
Okay. I feel like I hope I can come down here because I feel like I'm far away from you all. But I think I'm a bit of a outlier here because I don't teach religion or anything like that. But certainly I do challenge normalities in the classroom. As I was sitting there, I was thinking, I was kind of looking over at the laptop, and I'm thinking maybe I should have retitled or changed the title of my talk. It says Teaching Race at a Predominantly White Institution, but I think that the challenge that I have teaching race at a white institution, because I'm teaching race at a white Catholic institution while being black, right? And so that offers a number of challenges because, of course, if you're talking about race, it may be challenging for students to see beyond the professor who's African American because it's like, wow, can I say what I want to say? And obviously, when you're talking about race, the thing that you want most in the classroom is to have a robust and open, honest discussion. And so my subtitle is, of course, The Perils and the Pitfalls. When Marshall asked me to be a part of this panel, I didn't expect that I would be an actual object lesson of this discussion. But unfortunately, as I say here, Exhibit 1, this Breitbart piece came out on me, and this was, May 25th. Meet Valerie Johnson, the radical professor indoctrinating DePaul's black students. I mean, imagine the shock at that. But there's a little piece down here. It says, radicals are made, not born. Just so at DePaul University, where the professor personally mentored both Edward Ward and Kayla Johnson, the activists who stormed the stage and threatened violence at a Milo event on campus yesterday. This all happened last Tuesday, not last night, but a week ago. And my every waking moment since has been like responding to this madness. But one thing that I think they picked up on, because they've kind of targeted several professors based on a certain profile, either people who teach race or people who teach religion, people who teach gender studies or, LGBTQ studies, or so it's sort of like a hotbed. And so this guy Milo, have any of you all ever heard of him? Oh, you've heard of him. Okay, yeah. Well, he's a provocateur, right? To say the least. And so he sort of comes at you, and he kind of tours college campuses, and his thing is to sort of light the fuse, and then he's off to his next destination, leaving sort of chaos in his way. And so the faculty and those of us who teach courses that may challenge normalities have certainly been challenged this week, okay? And it really has been hurtful, because I think there is this tendency when you're not teaching from, I guess, the regular canon, so to speak, there is this tendency to question whether what you're teaching is even legitimate. And then, of course, you have the pressure of facing your students, their normalities or their sort of, their belief system. But I like to think of myself as, or my pedagogy as transformative, because it serves a number of goals, at least in my mind. One is to empower marginalized groups, and that's where I got in trouble with this Milo guy. He has like 230-something thousand Twitter followers. And so when he put my email address and my office phone number on his Twitter feed, then that meant that I was just barraged. I mean, it was like, get her, And so some of the things that they said, dealing with some of the students who protested his event, suggested that, I guess some people might say, wow, you did a real good job empowering marginalized students, but then on the other hand, it's a double-edged sword, because it was used against me, and it was chilling, it was DePaul right now. I don't know whether you all saw the Tribune today, the Chicago Tribune, but Eric Zorn and the editorial board did 2 pieces on this whole thing. And so it's a question, is this hate speech or is this free speech? And I, of course, think that it's hate speech, but the university has sided on the side of, well, not Milo, but the group, the college Republicans who invited him. And so the antagonists in this drama are the mainly black students. And so it's very interesting. So I look at it as empowering marginalized groups in the sense of like pedagogy of the oppressed, Paulo Freire model, where you are trying to get students to understand things that may be useful for them to empower themselves in their own communities, but also educating those who apply an ahistorical or colorblind racism approach. Because when you're teaching race in an environment that already believes that, hasn't all that been solved? I constantly am faced with this sort of, slavery's been over since 1865, any sort of disproportionality with regards to socioeconomic or political is certainly the part, that's their fault. It has nothing to do with societal structures. And so, the challenge is educating those who are ahistorical, who don't have a clue about, past discrimination, let alone continuing discrimination, and use a colorblind approach. And by colorblind racism, I mean Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He has a book, Racism Without Races, where he argues that colorblindness, there is a such thing as colorblind racism. When people say, okay, I don't see race, then that essentially means that you are also avoiding the inequality of race. So it's like, oh, I don't see race, let's just start here. As I always say to my students, it's like a Monopoly game gone bad. Marshall and I, for example, we're playing Monopoly, and halfway through the game, I realize that he's cheating. I call him out on it. He's contrite. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let's change the rules. And then, of course, he says, let's resume the game, right? Obviously, the problem with resuming the game is that you have Boardwalk, Park Place, all of those green houses, the little hotels. So it's kind of like, okay, we're resuming the game, but what we really ought to do is restart the game. Now, we know that in America, we're not likely to restart the game, but at least people, when they talk about issues pertaining to politics or poverty, should in fact understand that the Monopoly game has gone wrong, right? And so, so trying to assist students in understanding that is very difficult. And so, it turns into I don't see race, this sort of we live in a post-racial society, and so it's challenging that, and also confronting racial myths in the classroom. Even in this day, it may be a challenge to explain that minorities, that it is in fact nurture, not nature, that there is no sort of genetic inequalities by race. And so, getting students to understand that race is a social construction, that it only has the value that we apply to it, can often be difficult. Getting students to understand that just as advantages are cumulative, disadvantages are cumulative, right? I always argue that socioeconomic disparity that existed between African Americans and whites in 1865, when 4 million slaves were free, still exists today. There is a $50,000 differential between the median household income for whites in the city of Chicago and the median household income for blacks in Chicago. That differential has never been resolved. So that's, I think, a challenge to get people to understand. Also, assisting students to construct solutions. I mean, it's one thing to talk about these things. Poverty. I have a course, Poverty in Public Policy. I have a course, The Politics of Urban Education, African American Politics, and on and on and on. And so it's one thing to talk about these things, but of course, at the end of the day, students, they are typically, hopefully, by the end of 10 weeks, empowered to want to do something about it. And so assisting them, regardless of whether it's a conservative approach or a liberal approach, to come up with some solutions can be an interesting challenge. Also, dealing with externalities, both on campus and also on campus and off campus. I think externalities off campus is an example of the whole Milo incident. It's like, okay, here you have parents as well as people at large who look at certain courses that are taught about race, and they're like, oh my God, is that even real? I mean, they were even, challenging whether my PhD was legitimate, so it's sort of like urban education, isn't that an oxymoron? So I mean, the comments that I got were just chilling. It's like, black politics, is there a course on that? The modern university has courses like this. And so, dealing with those type of externalities, as well as on campus, people getting, like our administration, I'm not here to dog out the administration, but they often are challenged in terms of understanding the significance, importance of courses that challenge normatives, and certain normatives. So that certainly is a challenge. Encouraging discourse. I think one of the challenges is to assist students to examine their own prejudices, and I try to do that by making it a comfortable environment. Sometimes you have to tell something about your own prejudices, obviously, to get people to open up about their own. Another sort of method that I like to use, at DePaul we have like service learning courses, but then we can also teach any course as a service learning option. So in lieu of some other requirement, you give them a service option. And so, for instance, in my Politics of Urban Education course, I place students at an inner city public school. So they can see, front and center, the disparities that exist. And then, of course, the reflection is very important. And so when students do a service option, and then even those students who don't do a service option, we use those students who do as a sort of way to reflect on issues. So these are some examples of some of my prompts for service learning option courses. The initial stereotypes that you held about the clientele. I must say that there have been times when I have read reflection papers and literally cried. It's just been so poignant, to see the transformation of students, when they confront their own prejudices, their own myths or misunderstandings. And so the initial stereotypes, the accuracy, inaccuracy of your stereotypes, and initial anxiety, because typically the placement sites are on like the west or south side of Chicago. So for students who come from a predominantly white, middle class or upper class setting, it may be challenging for them to go into the hood, right? But it is, in fact, a learning tool. The characteristics and conditions of the neighborhood, I try to get them to see, to ask themselves, like, for instance, can you imagine growing up there? How might your life had been if you had grown up there? The types of businesses in the neighborhood, are people owners, just to get them to understand how different their lives are vis-a-vis the lives of the people that they are coming into contact with. So I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to the question and answer period. Okay?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. The second button comes to Laurie.
Thank you, Valerie. That was really fascinating, and I think very appropriate to some of the things that I'm going to say. I have a friend, Ed Bloom, who teaches at San Diego State, who's fond of saying that in the American context, whenever you're talking about religion, you're always already talking about race. So I think equipping us to have that as part of the conversation is incredibly important. So I want to start by thanking you for this invitation. I really am humbled to be back here in this building where I learned so much, and I can feel the presence of so many wonderful teachers who were incredibly effective and so good to me over the years. I have to say too that I brought some props. I love the title of this series, and I love it because it reminds me of my uncle Hans Alfried. So Hans Alfried is now living. He's retired to an East Frisian village. It's about 90 minutes west of Bremen, and as long as I've known him, he's had hobbies, though never more than one at a time. He's been a painter, he's been an avid trout fisher. He has owned and flown raptors, that was cool. He's been into clay sculpture. It's kind of a German thing, I think, to really have some hobbies really kind of get into. Most recently, he's been working with wood and producing, of all things, pens. Here's one. Every one of these things is completely unique. He chooses the wood, he turns it himself, he stains it, he fits it with a mechanism, and then he generally gives it away. He's not a craftsman per se, he's a retired primary care physician, but his disposition is toward being absorbed by an activity, mastering it, and then finding all kinds of joy in the work. The title of your series, Craft of Teaching, also reminds me of craft in another sense, craft foods, which has a large factory in Champaign, Illinois, and a corporate headquarters here in the northwest suburbs. Kraft Foods is in many ways the antithesis of Uncle Alfred. Kraft is in the business of the mass production and global distribution of mostly processed foods. The company tries to get nourishment, broadly understood, that is both tasty and stable to as many people as possible and to make gobs of money doing it. I pulled this prop out of our fridge at home. My wife bought it by mistake. The kids hate Asiago cheese. So you can consider it my donation to the Wednesday lunch effort here. I worked on the Wednesday lunch for 4 years, met my wife on Wednesday lunch crew. So I will be that, or maybe one of you can take it home and put it in your food. So Kraft has been in business almost as long as the U of C, though in a far wider array of forms. And whether or not you like macaroni and cheese out of the box, you have to admit that Kraft has done quite well, and I would argue also has done good. So both crafts of teaching are a part of my professional life. For now, I'm going to cede the floor to my colleagues and to you when it comes to the Uncle Alfred craft of the sea of teaching, instead directing my comments more toward the American cheese craft of the K of teaching. Where I work, my colleagues and I love seminars, we love small classes, we love the relationships that we forge in them and the conversations that they allow. But we can't ever lose sight of the importance of reaching and teaching large numbers of students and meeting the particular challenges that we encounter in large format classes. Okay. Let's navigate. If you drive west on 55th Street, turn south on 94, follow signs for I-57, and drive 135 miles, you will reach the University of Illinois, where I've been teaching since 2005. When I was a graduate student here from 1997 through 2004, that 2-hour drive may as well have been a mission to Jupiter. Of course, I was aware of the destination, but I was not going to attempt the journey. Moreover, I had no room in my consciousness for the University of Illinois, none. I did not know what it was good for. I did not know what things it did, much less did well. I did not know that anyone there studied or taught religion. I used exactly no mental energy thinking about the place, and I know that I was not alone. This workshop gave me occasion to remind myself of my prior non-relationship to the University of Illinois. We're talking about navigating normativity. Navigation is complicated stuff and is next to impossible if a navigator has no sense of the land, sea, or space scape through which she wishes to move. So allow me to map out a few features of my world for you. There are roughly 34,000 undergraduates at the U of I. Most of them come from Illinois, half from the Chicago area, about half from downstate. We have the highest percentage of international students of any public university in the US. The majority of them, the vast majority, actually come from China, although there are significant percentages from Korea and from India and Pakistan as well. The largest college at the U of I in terms of enrollment is liberal arts and sciences. But the university is best known for fields outside of the liberal arts: engineering, computer science, crop sciences, and veterinary medicine. In terms of personal religious commitments, our students map closely onto broader American trends, though having 1 in 10 students come from China likely moves our campus numbers above national averages when it comes to traditionally East Asian religions, maybe even evangelical Christianity, which seems to be quite popular. But anecdotally, I see it on campus quite a bit among Chinese students. The Department of Religion has 12 full-time faculty members, about 20 majors, and a small MA program. We serve the university and its students in many ways. The one that I want to consider today, and this will be a little bit of a repeat of some conversations that you had with my colleague Dove Weiss in the fall, is our general education curriculum and our largest offering within it, Religious Studies 110, World Religions. We teach world religions in both semesters and online in the summer. Each year, about 1,200 students take the course. That's just a little smaller than the entire freshman, a little smaller than the entire freshman class here at the University of Chicago. 80% of that 1,200 come from outside of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. We teach the course as a team during the semesters. Faculty members come in for 4 or 5 lectures, focusing on the tradition that is their specialization. The coordinator of the course, a position that I've had about 8 times, introduces the class with a few lectures, concludes it, and then deals with myriad administrative headings. In my capacity as the coordinator of Religious Studies 110 and as the sole instructor during the summer online version of the class, I don't have much opportunity to encounter students' normative stances, much less engage them in a sustained way. But I know that they have them. So the normativity problem, as far as I see it in Religious Studies 110, is getting students to notice their own unconsidered norms. Frankly, it doesn't matter to me much if a student believes that her or his religious tradition offers the only valid account of reality or the only path to salvation. What I care about is the unconsidered or unconscious importation of those values into the presumably neutral term religion. Put differently, the normative destination toward which I try to steer them is the simple realization that religion, as they use the term, is not value neutral. They have their own ideas about what religion is and ought to be, and that others do not share those ideas. Basic stuff. I know that the craft of teaching forces a close consideration of goals in connection with a large group of students, the vast, vast majority of whom will never take another course in the study of religion. And so I have a reading and a classroom exercise. The reading is the introduction to J.Z. Smith's Imagining Religion. 3 great pages for fueling discussion. They're easy to read. They are nearly impossible to exhaust. Quote, "Religion is solely the creation of the scholar's study. Religion has no independent existence apart from the academy." Unquote. I do not grow tired of watching students wrestle with those 2 sentences. The exercise also has to do with imagining religion. In a lecture, I ask all 600 students to close their eyes. They sit there in stunned silence for a little bit. But I insist, we are all closing our eyes. I ask them then to think about religion. Part 3, I ask them to draw an image that comes to mind. And then I ask them to turn to a neighbor, a student who is sitting near them, or a few students who are sitting nearby, to just show their image and to discuss it. At the end of the class, they hand the drawings to a teaching assistant as they file out. That's it. What does this accomplish? Well, artistically, it's quite cool, and it often makes me smile, which is no small thing. But the pedagogical force that I hope it has is, first, in the externalizing of that which is internal, and the forcing of an encounter in a pretty safe environment with others' newly articulated thoughts, or, one could argue, norms. Everybody imagines religion in connection with something specific. The second effect is that of demonstrating the diversity that exists right in the classroom and therefore the community. Students draw a lot of images, and not all Christians, Jews, or Hindus draw the same image. The unspoken consensus that one may have imagined is not a consensus at all. The difference that one may have felt, and perhaps felt as off-putting, is a difference shared by many. On the last day of class, we came back this semester. We came back to these drawings as a way to reflect on the class. Most of the 600 students were present because they had to turn in papers that day. And what I have here are just some slides from that concluding lecture. So asking them to think back to this exercise where we started. I asked you to close your eyes and to imagine religion. And I had gone through all 600 of the drawings and chosen some that I liked especially. So here they are. Students imagine what looks to be maybe an altar with some incense burning, and it looks like it has a kind of East Asian resonance. Maybe it's a Chinese Confucian altar, maybe it's in a Buddhist temple. We have on the your right there a kind of androgynous divine figure looking over the world with power shooting out from her or his hands. We have religion imagined as a family inheritance, something passed down through the generations. We have students thinking of religion in connection to the circumambulation of Kaaba, the Hajj, and Hanukkah there in the north. So again, making the point that religion doesn't exist out there as a kind of amorphous category, that it's always connected to specifics, and those specifics have theological and ritual resonances. Reminding them too of the multiple forms that religion takes in terms of practice. And a student drew a person meditating there. We have a rendering of the Eucharist, and really of the 600, this was the one on the bottom right here was one of my favorites. A group of people surrounding the book of whatever. So I guess that's making the point about the textual basis for religious kind of interesting moments. The students also have a nice sense of humor about this. And one of the next steps then is the sort of why do we care about these things? And skip over this slide because my class was positioned in the lecture hall between meteorology and accounting. I made a point about the forces that we encounter in the weather and things that are, these grand forces. A tornado comes ripping through town, there's not a whole lot you can do. Accounting forces your head down into numbers and crunching numbers and managing your finances and more religion somewhere in between. It wasn't an especially effective pedagogical moment in retrospect, but really connecting then the ideas that they had about what constitutes religion to realities in the United States. So the Hindu temple of Greater Wisconsin in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a mosque in Akron, Ohio, Wat Dhammagunaram Temple in Salt Lake City, Utah, Prairie Zen Center. No, this is not Prairie. This is Northern Light Zen Center in New Brunswick, Maine. So moving them outward from their own ideas and the diversity of ideas about religion that they had experienced in the classroom to thinking about the complexity of the landscape they would be navigating, whether the religious landscape that they would be navigating, whether it was as global citizens going on, engineering projects to South Asia, or if they chose to spend the rest of their lives in Champaign-Urbana, where all of these traditions are represented. A few more slides along those lines. So you see, what I'm accomplishing here is it's not Talal Assad. It's not Charles Taylor, it's not Bruce Lincoln, it's not Tracy Fessenden. We're not mapping the quietly Protestant contours of American secularism. But we are, I think, giving the students, I hope, giving the students some normative calories that are not empty, And that just might have an impressive shelf life, although probably nothing quite like this. And I'll cede the floor now to Professor Zoloth. Thank you.
What are some questions first?
Oh, we're going to do questions at the end. Here, I can disarm mine.
I want to start by apologizing for being late on the north side. But actually, it was because there was a shooting today at UCLA, which seems very far away, but I have a son and a girlfriend who work at UCLA, and it was a tense 3 hours with texting them as they were like hiding under chairs.
Oh, boy.
So it was one of those moments that you see on CNN. Yeah.
I'm not seeing it.
And I told Professor got killed.
Professor got killed?
Professor got killed, yeah. It was apparently murder suicide. So we were supposed to like not be upset because it was a murder suicide. Mine will take the jacket off. So no, that's not official. Thank you. So it's been a long day, and what we had today was the project to write the human genome. The embargoed paper was released to us today, so we had a chance to talk to everyone about why it was theologically problematic to create an artificial human genome. Right? Even if they were going to make a person yet, it's so problematic. So it was a busy day for bioethics. I want to talk up there. Well, let me start while she's doing this. I don't stare aimlessly at a random professor. Let me say that I teach a class in scriptural reasoning. Has anyone ever heard of scriptural reasoning? Practice of scriptural reasoning? Yes, nods. So this practice began about 25 years ago now in the American Academy of Religion, when several of us who were trained in postmodern Jewish philosophy began meeting with people who were trained in rabbinics to read through Talmudic texts together as philosophers, right? So we would do a close reading, and we wouldn't say, oh, this is what the history of responsible literature was about this text. We would say, in fact, this is what, hoping the IT person shows up, this was what the meaning of the text seems to us. This is the argument, the logic of the argument, the reasons of the argument that come through in Talmud. And we began doing that for about 3 years. That's how it fell apart. Hopelessly arguing about Israel, as Jewish studies scholars are wont to do. But before that happened, we got visited by some Christians in the academy, Daniel Hardy and David Ford in particular, from Cambridge. And they came to watch us study together. They were invited by Peter Oakes because they ran into each other in a vacation home. And they came to watch us reason through the Talmudic texts. Read them, think about them, remind ourselves about songs. And they said, let's do it, we can do it too. So we began figuring out texts that we could share together. Texts that were scriptural from Hebrew scripture and from New Testament. Places where the stories coincided or referenced one another or seemed to be speaking about the same issues. And we began reading them together. An act that was controversial, actually, in the academy, because some of our colleagues in Jewish thought didn't want to work with Christians around these texts. And so they left. And then, after about 2 years of doing that with Christians and Jews, we decided that Muslims should be a part of this encounter. And so we invited scholars from the Islamic tradition. Some of them were graduate students we knew. We invited them in. And some of the Christians decided they didn't want to study with Muslims. But yet we were left with a hardy group of people who really did want to read these texts together and think about them, quite frankly, as the words of God. Understood as the words of God by what we're trained to say in the reception communities. Right? So one of the things I want to think about today is why that project of scriptural reasoning was different. It's alive. And why it's different is because something was the same about all of us. We were people who were practitioners of our religious traditions, and we're serious practitioners, like daily daveners in our religious traditions, and took these words as if they were this kind of special, important texts that we have for years carried as scriptural texts, as sacred texts. So we took them seriously, and we didn't want to do, we knew the documentary hypothesis, and it's very compelling, right? We knew it. We went to graduate school too, so we knew that. But we decided not to think in that terms, but to think about what these texts mean to us, both in that time and this time. What's going on in these texts? And how can we talk about them as theologians? So that was also brought together by the sense that that was an inappropriate activity within the American Academy. Right? There was something sort of furtive about it, which is why we met 11 at night in the AAR over chips and Coke, thinking about these texts as if it was a secret act, but to sincerely believe in the truth of these texts in a way that, say, a biologist would believe in normal, right? Was somehow prohibited. So we read these texts together, and for the last 20 years now, we've been working together. I'm talking about these texts. Music. Yes, okay. So we've been talking about these texts together, and that's been going on for many years among professors, largely at Cambridge, but also at the American Academy of Religion. It's now a section of the AAR. You can all come to a section and you can study texts together. The challenge for me is what do I do about these commitments to Orthodox Judaism, to these texts as in, and not to lead this sort of this bifurcated life in which over here in shul, I'm allowed to really think through what the meaning of this is, but over here in my office or in my lecture hall, I'm not really allowed to say, this is a truth claim and believe it. And to be a professor of religion, I think to some extent is to struggle with that problem, with that issue. How do I do it sincerely? How do I take as seriously the truth claim of these texts as I do the truth claim of science, which I also care deeply about? The interesting thing for me was I was also struggling with another commitment, which is politics. Right? When I'm teaching texts about Torah texts about the land of Israel, right? Quranic texts that discuss the relationship of the Jews and the end of days of the land of Israel, the contingency of that promise, how do I then put forward my politics, my progressive, albeit Zionist politics? How much should that play a role in my teaching? Do I pull back and say, I'm just a neutral person, here's these texts, do with them what you will? How much do my politics infuse it? And this came to a head for me. Oh, here's someone who's thinking this through carefully, thank you. This came to a head to me when I decided to do two things. Yes! And I used the word. Yay. One was when I became the president of the American Academy of Religion. See how official I look behind like a desk with PowerPoint? When I became president of the American Academy of Religion, I had to choose a theme. It magically started. But stay there and first gets upset.
Sorry about that.
I had to choose a theme for the meeting, what we should think about. And I decided not to think about ourselves, which is one of the things we're most fond of doing, ourselves. And to think rather about who we were as scholars of religion in a complete crisis that was overtaking humanity, which is the crisis of climate. And I began the AAR this way, and I want you to begin it this way too. The second issue came up for me when I began teaching freshmen in a freshman seminar at Northwestern University. And for the first time, I wasn't just talking to other professors of religion. I was talking to a randomly selected group of people. A very few of them were connected to the Quran. Their parents sort of were vaguely Muslim, but they knew they were supposed to read it, but they had guiltily crept into Northwestern. Several Jews, some of whom didn't admit to being Jews until about halfway through the course, and many, many Christians, and a plucky handful of secularists, proud secularists, who didn't believe in anything, they never read anything, right? And so the process begins with us reading comparative texts at the elementary level. This is an example of the Noah text in two traditions, Genesis 5 and Surah 71. So you're going to do a little practice here, just like you would be in my classroom. So we're a little dyad here, try to. Turn to your neighbor. Find a neighbor, don't sit in the lecture hall again. Find a neighbor. Okay. And I want you to talk about these texts. So the first thing is going to be you read the text aloud. One of you reads the text aloud once, and then twice, and then begin discussing it, okay? It'll be noisy, like a Talmudic study hall. But for me, that's the essence of what this means. You have to own the text by speaking the text, which, by the way, is really important for teaching freshmen. You have to really say, this is the noise I make when I speak the text, and then I'll tell you next time what I do after me. Sure.
Okay. So,
And it might, maybe not, they're doing it very interesting. If they do this. That's really a characteristic.
And that is interesting, especially if you're this is very significant for you know that there was.
Okay, so it's hard to stop once you get going. I know. So what are some of the things that you saw in these two texts? The difference between, who can tell me about Hebrew Bible Noah? What's the characteristic of Hebrew Bible Noah? Anybody come on? Does he talk? Ever? Not a word, right? Silent. Does he try to convince people to come, like, repent? Nope. Goes on the boat with his kids. Right? Because, like, he sort of doesn't do anything bad. He's not killing or thinking evil thoughts. He's seen. But he's not, his agency is problematic. What about Quranic knowledge?
Right. They call people. That's what I see.
Yeah, and then Noah goes out. Right. He prophesizes this is coming. Change, you can change. You don't have to be part of this. And Noah's family. What happens? Does anyone know Quranic Noah story? What happens with Noah's son? He has a son that doesn't go with him. It goes to the mountains and is swept away in the flood. Doesn't believe. His son is swept away. So notice the difference now. So imagine you're 18. You've never read the Quran. You may never have read Hebrew scriptures, especially if you're a Protestant from the Midwest, right? You might never have seen either of these stories. Maybe someone has mentioned Noah's story, but it's like a cute little ark, like adorable Noah. and here we are, I say to the students, faced with the same kind of clear warning. What more do you want than it's so hot in Bangkok that the chickens are roasting as they walk about? It's like, really, what more do we need to know about what's happening in the world? And so I showed them another text, right? And here's a text about the IPCC, the UN governmental panel, that prophesizes in its own way the same thing. It is coming at 10. And for the final exam, I gave my students this assignment. I said, you tell me what is the most important problem facing you as Americans today. What's really an important problem? And then I told them to seek the same responses in the text that I had saw with climate change. And I said to them, you go out, they're still writing my question's very late, they're still writing the finals. Send me worried emails about, is this a big enough problem? And they had to give me the problems in advance, so I could make sure they were doing something non-trivial. And then I said, now go out and you seek some text that might give us new language. Because the language we have to deal with climate change is the language of science and technology, and as Pope Francis has reminded him in his encyclical, in fact, the language of science and technology carries with it values, structures of worth, that then we just inherit unless we come up with alternate language and alternate systems of values, which is what they're seeking. So we'll see how it goes. I also walked them through one of my favorite texts in the Talmud. Is anyone familiar with this text? So when you say in the Talmud, on that day, it always refers to one day. And this is a day about teaching. On that day, when this, as the story tells us, the doorkeeper was removed, no one guarding, no admissions tests, no criteria, and permission was given to the disciples to enter. Anyone, any student. The Rabbi Gamliel, who was a ruling class sort of authority figure in the Talmud, had issued a proclamation saying no disciple whose character does not correspond to his exterior may enter the Bet HaMikdash. So we only want to have like certain people in here, but the doorkeeper has made a different decision, and suddenly the door is open. Not in accordance with this idea that you have to be sort of beautiful and put together and get high SATs, right? But on that day, many stools were added. Rabbi Yochanan said, this is typical, I teach some Talmudic number game. There's a difference of opinions on this matter between Abba, Yosef, and Dosai, and the rabbis. One authority said that 400 stools were added, and the other says 700. If you've ever been to a Passover Seder, you know the game of multiplying numbers. This being the case, I skip part of this when I teach this case, I will go and apologize to Rabbi Joshua, and when he reached his house, he saw that the walls were black. Why is the senior authority figure apologizing to Rabbi Joshua? Because they had a difference of opinion about refugees, about who can enter, about converts. Can all those people coming in the door, can all those people really include people who converted? I say, people who are refugees, who don't have any heritage, don't know who they are, They're Jews, they're not Jews, can anyone come in? And he said no, and Joshua had said yes. And there's been a discussion, and the discussion has ended in the favor of Rabbi Joshua. And when he reached his house, he goes to Rabbi Joshua, and he says the walls were black. So far, not Rabbi Joshua, who's sitting there. The walls are black, and the reason the walls are black is because it is apparent you're a charcoal burner, which is the lowest profession in all of rabbinic Judaism. You're taking like leftover wood that's been left over from building, and you're burning it for charcoal, right? So the scholar who was defeated, the most important senior figure in the Talmudic moment, is a charcoal burner. And Rabbi Joshua replied, alas for the generation of which you are the leader, seeing that you know nothing of the troubles of the scholars, their struggles to support and sustain themselves. And he said to him, I apologize, forgive me. Okay, I apologize. So this is a text when they learn it about what it means to learn from people who are impoverished, and to let the impoverished, degraded Rabbi Joshua lead and win the Talmudic discussion. Right? And I explained to them that the impulse of the Talmud, the 20-volume book in English, is often about repairing injustice that's occurred in earlier centuries of Judaism, and the strong voice for the poor, as it is here, which is a way that I get to talk about my political commitments. Now, this was about feminism, and we go back to the end of that parsha about Noah, and God, after destroying every bunny and cockroach and mosquito and every single thing, makes a promise not to do it again. And the students read this book, this section, of all of the days of the earth, seed and harvest and cold and warm and summer and winter, and day and night, no, they shall not cease, lo Shabbato. Why this is important, lo Shabbato, they will not stop. The students then struggle with this notion of interruption, like the interruption in the Talmud, I tell them, and like the interruption of the voice of the poor in your profession, in your life, in your story, that it will not cease, but now we're on the brink of a cessation of human life. And this promise is really fraught, is really up for grabs. I walk them through this textual account of what it means to be lost in a situation of danger, to be faced with the prophetic necessity, and then in fact, this helps them talk through, find new language for what would normally be a straight political position paper, right? What does it mean to teach them the language of Torah and of Quran and of New Testament? It means they have new possibilities for hearing what generations of people have understood to be the best words, the most chosen words of justice. Now, when we read about the land or when we read about violence, the texts are not so beautiful. They're very complicated. We had a session on violence in which we did the verses of the sword from the Quran, and we did the encounter between Saul and Samuel when Saul has inadequately killed every last living thing in his war of genocidal destruction. And then we did the story of the New Testament of Jesus threatening the life of his family if his followers didn't follow him, right? So this discussion was a way, through pure textual discourse, for them to see that the story of religion and violence is profound and is pervasive. Right? So these texts, and the texts that teach you that in fact we have more that we share in common than that we fall apart in difference, are ways of thinking about scriptural reasoning that I say is a practice of peace. Now, our group of scriptural reasoners has stayed together through a very long and difficult time, Jews and Christians and Muslims. We learned to meet before 9/11. We met all through that, all through Homeland Security and all through ISIS and all through the West Bank, occupied territories and such. And yet we stay together because the language we speak is not political. Sorry. The language we speak is theopolitical. And the theopolitical warrant in these texts allows us to create a practice of pedagogy, but also a practice of peacemaking. And that's all I want to say. Okay.
about 45 minutes, perhaps a little less, whatever you want. Questions, we can just open the floor now.
You said 45?
Yeah, well,
No.
we can be
I-
much less, of
I
course.
just, in some ways you were saying 4 to 5. 45.
I have plenty of time. So whoever wants to start. Danielle.
I have a question for Professor Johnson.
Yes.
I haven't taken a political science class in a long time,
Mhm.
so this was exciting for me because these areas can be a little separated considering one usually falls in social sciences and one falls in humanities.
Right.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about when we're trying to confront these normative issues, I think in particular with confronting racial myths and the idea that race is a social construction. Where do you see, I don't know if maybe you've had anybody who's had a particularly profound transformation or something in how we understand race to be a social construct, but then our individual identities are so important to us.
Right. Yeah.
Because I think within religion too, and especially if you're a practitioner who studies maybe the tradition you practice, that's something that can be very difficult to navigate either as someone who's instructing or trying to be fair to
The fact that they exist.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that, for me, the first step is sort of like an undoing in order to get back to yourself. How do you understand, for example, your privilege or lack thereof in the world if you don't understand it vis-a-vis, the beginning, if you will? So when I'm discussing America, it's like, okay, let's look at the world before there was statutory slavery, or before we just totally decimated Indian land or appropriated Indian or Mexican land. And, to look at it in terms of the relationships, it was like black and white, or Native American, everybody got along. They married, they had communities together. And so you did not have this hierarchy of races. And so I think that unless you go back, then you really can't see yourself in the present period. And then we just go through a variety of public policies that have, sort of brought us to where we are today. I hope that answered your question. It's sort of like, yes, it is a fact that there are people who have privilege and there are those who don't. But understanding that, because I think most people are not really aware of their privileges, and but understanding that is sort of like, there has to be, I guess, an unraveling and a comparison, if you will.
Do you have students who, in this conversation about race as a social construct, though, whose identities and lives are still very, for whom racial identity is still very important,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's as a Asian American, Hispanic American, African American,
Right.
and might read that conversation as kind of corrosive of their...
No, I've never experienced that before, where it's sort of like, because I'm not saying in the present period that your race or ethnicity is not important, but to get them to understand, because most students, when they arrive at classes like politics of urban education, African American politics, they arrive with some view about why things are the way they do. So for instance, the first day of class, I give my students, I should have mentioned that, I give my students a little brief survey, and I ask, in the case of, let's say, urban education, why is urban education so bad, right? And or why is it that African Americans are disproportionately poor? And so it's to get them to understand that this is a social construction based on, economic interests, to get them to understand, why we are where we are today. So it's not a sort of devaluing of where we are in their race or ethnicity. It's just to get them to understand that there are no differences between people. And so I think that most students arrive at courses like this with some deeply ingrained views that there are, perhaps. Because how do you uphold the myth of democracy and equality, right? It's sort of like you're problematizing this. It's sort of like, well, how do we on one hand say that we are equal, but then we treat people this way?
So what's really interesting is that what I think is the single hardest thing when you're teaching undergraduates, especially not selected because you're teaching, they haven't come to my cool course on climate change, they're just in a random seminar that they've got numerically divided, right? They think that their ideas are, they're the first person that ever had this thought, right? That no one else. So I often teach a class to medical students who've gone really far down this road, right? And now they're in medical school, and it's called Last Chance for Philosophy, right? And I teach moral philosophy, which is, of course, through Renaissance, through early modern period, antiquity, through early modernity, all religious. It shocks them to their core. But this notion that, in fact, this conversation about race, about ethnicity, about situations of origin, that's a very long-standing conversation,
right,
to which they have an idea at the end, but I think it's really important, which is what I like to teach Olympics, to bring them all the way back to what were when the Greeks noticed that the Mediterranean had different peoples in it, what did they say about it, right? So that's the moment that I really love. I really look forward to when I teach freshmen, when I teach undergrads in general.
Right.
That,
right.
that the Ring of Gyges is not made up by Tolkien. Right?
Another question for Professor Johnson, or either of you panelists, if you've experienced this, but I think something that a fear that I have in the back of my head when I think about future teaching is the kind of angry student who just won't accept or won't give up on the myths that the teacher
cognitive dissonance.
Right, and I'm wondering if you, is that fear justified? And if it is, what are some good ways of dealing with that?
Yeah, and I do encounter that often. Generally speaking, for instance, I want to use my African American politics course as an example. At one point, I started in the present period, right? And, but then I realized that you have to go back in history because they are very ahistorical, right? But it's amazing to me that students can come to an understanding that what has happened to African Americans in America, well, Africans in America, is patently unfair, and it's certainly in contradiction to our well-held principles, right? So they will get that. I mean, I'm talking about all of the students. They will be very clear, and typically it is their shock because they've been taught all along some other narrative, and so they'll get it. But then when you start talking about what should be done, that's when they want to hold on to their privilege. And so getting them to contrast, well, but wait a minute though, you're saying that nothing should be done about the inequality, the disproportionate inequality that exists, but you also said that it's, so it's this sort of, it's just getting them to see it. And actually, frankly, I'm not committed necessarily to getting them to solve the world's problems, but I'm interested in getting them to think about the fact that they still, despite knowing A, B, C, D, walk away with wanting the world to remain as it is.
So one of the things that I do that's important, this is just when I teach, I always teach with writing, right? So I always start with text that they have to respond to, and then I give them the text and some secondary source, and then they have to write something every single week, and a one-page paper. It's called an A paper because it's something like Cambridge does, right? They have very little called A paper. So they have to write them, and then when they come in on Monday, having written them over the weekend, they have to switch papers randomly, and then you have to defend the argument. You have to read another person's paper, and then you have to defend the argument of the other person, not your own argument. So that's how I begin a class, right? There's, Amy, defend Tony's paper, and they learn to read someone else's ideas and defend them and then critique them, but in every case, they have to first put forward the other person's argument, which is an extraordinary way of teaching them to see how other people think. And the papers start out really terribly in the first week, and then they get better and better and better, and then the defense gets better and better, and then they actually have a relationship. And then also, no one doesn't talk. Every person has to talk, but not about themselves, but about their colleagues' paper. So it's an interesting way of getting them off they're constantly thinking about their own ideas and their own positions.
Well, see, in my case, I want them to talk about their views and their opinions, because, and I've had some students to say some pretty shocking things. Like we were having a discussion about reparations and affirmative action, and this Eastern European woman, a recent immigrant, she said, I think blacks need to, just stop waiting around for reparations and move on. Right? And I'm like, okay.
You can strip us back into it.
Right. I mean, but I like it when students say stuff like that, or because then here are some other students in the back of the room like, what the hell did she say? But it's sort of like that dialogue, that argument, that debate, that's where true understanding comes through. And then you find at the end of the course, this woman is like, oh, so I think that, getting them to talk about their ideas, I think is a gift to some degree, because, you have to make them feel comfortable, first of all, to display their own emotions, their own thoughts and all of that. I'm not saying I'm gifted. Well, maybe I am. No, but it is a sort of way to do it. And it begins with, as I said, talking about your own prejudices, kind of talking about how you were raised and how you were taught. And then in short order, students are saying, yeah, hey, my father, or my mother, or, they talk about, the people in their communities and how they see different people.
I think we all have different ways of being in the classroom as teachers. I mean, you see some of that on display there today. And to the extent that the angry student becomes a problem, and it almost has never, I can remember one student who was upset about something that I said. But I think it can almost always be traced back to the instructor and a particular demeanor or approach that someone takes that probably isn't so advisable. And if you're trying to, you can certainly provoke all kinds of interesting conversations, but do so in a way that that isn't jerky,
right?
Or overbearing.
Right.
Because we're not. I don't think any of us think of ourselves as indoctrinating or pressing.
Except we actually have a lot of power. I mean, that's the thing, when professors have an extraordinary amount of power, and I don't know if it's just my polite Northwestern students, but they do all the reading, right? And not just because I give them random tests on it. Shock them into horrifying. But they do all the reading, and I taught at San Francisco State University, which is a working class university. People work, they have kids, it's a whole other thing. They're there, they want to be there, but they don't have time to read it. So it's really, the classroom really changes, a lot, place to place. But I do think that there's one thing in common, which is our power, which we have to be really careful about, to allow ourselves to always have that, challenge.
Right.
But it's interesting that you said that about letting people have emotions. Northwestern is considering having the students grade us on our microaggression and our handling of microaggression.
I'm glad.
You think? So
yeah, because I would like to see that at DePaul.
Really? Because I'm worried that it makes people less inclined to talk. The students will be less inclined to talk if they have to rate each other's.
Oh, the students have to rate each other.
Yeah, it's about.
I thought you meant rate the professors.
No, they're going to rate the professors, but they're also going to have to. Did I keep that microaggression in check? Kind of thing. And then
that's kind of dangerous.
That's a little over the top, right?
Yeah, that's a little over top for sure.
So,
but obviously, we do have a lot of power. But by showing the sort of the Brightburg piece, where they're accusing me of being indoctrinating, it was very painful. And, I was pleased that a lot of my students piled on. It was like, that is just crazy, But there are ways in which certain subjects themselves, no matter how you teach them, are viewed as indoctrinating because it is not a part of the norm, right? And so you're teaching, it's just like this, one of the comments to that article, I was talking about Brightburg. I don't know whether you know Milo, this guy, he's a provocateur. He was on campus on last week. And so as a result of a protest, then they started attacking certain professors, including myself, and with all these notions. And so it's like one of my signature courses is the politics of urban education. And one of the comments was like, urban education, isn't that an oxymoron? And so, so it's like, so it is not that I am indoctrinating at all. I check myself on that, but I think that the subject itself becomes viewed as potentially like off the rails.
Well, I think indoctrination makes it sound like that we're teaching in the pulpit, but I want their souls. Right? I want them to. I mean, what am I doing here if I don't want to really convince them that these set of ideas are really important? And I want their lives to be utterly, what I really want, I want their lives to be utterly changed by what they learn in my classroom.
Yes,
I want them to stagger away and think, wow, I used to be X and now I'm Y.
Right.
Of course, like why else would you do it?
And that is what, and I'm always pleased for those of my colleagues who teach senior capstone, they always say, oh, these students talked about your courses, I mean, that is transformative. And I started out my talk with talking about, sort of transformative teaching. And so I do agree with you. But I think that there is a big difference between sort of assisting students in that transformation versus sort of telling them what to think, sort of, okay, this is the only way, and so, or the way to look at it. So it's sort of like, I guess, a point of discovery as the course unfolds.
I'm not looking for converts.
Well,
So maybe I don't know why I do it. I don't know. I don't,
you want them to believe what you think, right?
well, no.
You don't want them to go away.
No, I mean, they're taking, so we were talking about this kind of craft of teaching, where I have a large format class, 600 students, and I don't ever learn their names. Maybe 5 of them come to my office hours across the course of the semester. I guess if I'm looking for any kind of conversion or transformation, it's an understanding that religion is an important force in the world. These are 90% of them are students in engineering, computer science, ag school folks. That religion matters and that they have ideas about religion that aren't shared by lots of them. That's kind of, that's one of the bars that I set. And there will be others who latch on to one of my colleagues' lectures on Confucianism and are really transformed by that. But my role in this class is a very different sort of.
Because it's an intro, a big intro. So be bold. Theology used to be like this whole building, like School of Divinity, like really this was a big important part of human education.
A critical pedagogy.
Yeah, exactly.
Problematizing.
Right. Don't
the norms.
Yeah. Don't give it up, man. I mean, I really have a phrase like it's like, oh, it's like all biology, and here we are. Just please pay some attention to religion, just a little bit, but it's like this should be something that human beings grapple with, which is especially if you're an American.
Right.
Good Lord, it's the most devout country, ranks way up there in terms of people who go to church. So, I mean, it's not consequential.
Right. Even in my introductory courses, I problematize like democracy, some of the principles. It's like, do we really have a democracy? I mean, certainly I could come in and do the flag waving thing, America the Beautiful, but I want them to think critically about this. And so in doing that, it is a problematizing. And if the end goal is nothing more than to just get them to step outside of their normatives and think, differently about it. See it from the, from someone else's point of view.
I think there was first.
Yes, I think we might have covered it already, but I was going off Dan's question about conflicts within the classroom, and I'm thinking more about post-trigger. What happens after two very contentious positions have been put on the table and there's no agreement? And we as TAs or teachers, I mean, I'm a student, but how do we get the argument to progress? Because it's very easy to get caught up in, most of the times are two very evident truths that are very, this is a person's truth. Very hard to convince somebody in an hour to change their truth. So how do you guys?
Well, one thing that I do a lot is, I let the students themselves kind of argue amongst themselves, because if I answer the question, then it's it can be imposing then. But let's say if there is a contentious issue, you get other students to kind of debate the issue until, maybe someone is saying it differently as a result of this debate. But it's this sort of like calling on people and having that sort of uncomfortable silence while they collect their thoughts. But it's important that everybody joins into the discussion. So I think when I was peer reviewing one of my colleagues, and I told him, I said, you know what, you didn't give it enough time, because I think he was afraid of the uncomfortable or awkward silence. So he'd throw out a question and everybody would look at him like deer in the headlights, and he'd say, well, and then he'd start answering the question, and so I don't think that that's a good way. It's sort of like, okay.
I once had a professor in my graduate program, and she said that what she did for undergraduates is they didn't answer the question, she would whip out her knitting and just going to sit there and say, I'm going to wait until someone says.
Right. And then also assuring them that it's a safe place for discussion. It's like, well, there are no right or wrong answers here.
No.
What do you think?
There are right and wrong answers.
Well, yeah, there are right or wrong, but in the context of them trying to tell how they feel about it.
So here's that moment. It happens, if you're teaching Jewish studies, it happens around Israel. That's the moment that it happens, right? And you have to look at that and say, look, this is a hard question. That's why we call this an ethical dilemma, because otherwise we'd call it like a slam dunk, right? It's a dilemma because there's two competing moral appeals. And they have to stand there, and they have to be there. And guess what, class? We've got to stay in this miserably uncomfortable moment in which these two truths have to exist and have to think there. Around ideas about God. God is very large, right? And so people can have substantially different ideas about abortion, right? About capital punishment, right? About stem cell research. If you teach bioethics, you were teaching controversy. You're teaching you're moving from one controversy to another. I did something that I don't know if I'm allowed to do anymore. I don't know if I'm allowed to do this. But it was about abortion, right? So I had a big chalkboard, and I said on this side, no abortion ever under any circumstance. And on this side was free abortion on demand, right? And then I asked the students to array themselves along that continuum. It being Northwestern, there was people all in different places, right? There was actually people in EFIN. And then I didn't say anything, and I said, okay, we're going to read cases. We did casuistry. We did case after case after case, and people kept moving around. Because there was a few people that were either committed Catholics, and they were right there, and they weren't going to move for any reason. Rape and incest, the whole thing. But it was really interesting to see how most people were able to go from one side to the other side.
So then there are no right or wrong answers.
Well,
it's like,
I believe there's a right answer. I'm a philosopher. I believe there's a right answer. I just don't know if we can always get to the right answer. We struggle to do it. But I do believe in rights and wrongs. I think there's things that are just wrong.
I do agree.
Right?
But in the case of, because I've heard some fervent arguments for choice and pro-life, and so I can't say that I'm not willing. We get into with American government. Of course, we talk about identity, sexual identity. There are a number of issues that come up, and I'm not, I think, I don't feel comfortable saying, okay, well, if you're this, then that's wrong, or, and so.
That's why texts are important. It's like, then you can just say, well, isn't it interesting that there's not a word really in the New Testament that condemns gay people? Isn't it interesting that there's one verse in Exodus that talks about abortion, sort of, kind of, miscarriage maybe? Isn't it interesting that the texts that you think were replete with judgment are really kind of absent of much of this, about sexuality? So it's I mean, so you
and maybe because we're teaching two
well, also like when you turn to Hume or something, right? I don't know if you're teaching Hume, but
No,
you're a political scientist, right?
Right, but I'm.
So when you teach, you defend the positions of some people you teach, right? You must.
Oh yeah.
So there's those texts that you can turn to, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. I do. Yeah. But in terms of issues like right or wrong,
Yeah.
I'm not prepared to say that my point of view is correct. I just want students to think critically about what their position is.
So you would say there's good or bad arguments. But could you have a good argument defending
right? If it is, yeah. Well,
maybe.
Well, something terrible. I mean, if you're talking about killing someone, that's a problem. Yeah, but yeah, I don't think it's my place to say what's right or wrong about contentious issues as much as get students to think critically about what it is that they are thinking about.
Or you can say things like in bioethics, you can say something like, there's a consensus among American bioethics about the need for genetic intervention for therapeutic purposes, but not for enhancement purposes, right? So you can say, or you could say, in the reception community that receives and lives by this text, this is how it's understood. Right? So there's ways to position that, right?
Thank you. So I went to college here a long time ago, and I was in a Western Civ class, Western Civilization, and this poor girl was trying to express herself, and she kept saying, well, I just feel, and the professor cut her off and said, this is the University of Chicago, where we presume to think. What you feel is irrelevant. And, okay, so that was really harsh.
That's alienating.
I don't know. I'll say things like that.
Let me finish. So I left.
I feel you.
I got my master's somewhere else, and there, at Yale Divinity School, and there it was very much. There was a lot of I statements, a lot of people training to be in the ministry. They were all well versed in how to have non-conflict conversations, and there was a lot of hesitancy to criticize certain positions. And I felt like that was often connected to the way they were being framed. This is the way I feel about this. Well, I can't disagree with how you feel about it. You feel that way about it. And so I come back here, and it's a little bit more like the college here. And I guess what I'm saying is I found in my life this is a small sample size. It seems to me that there's somewhat of a trade-off between like detachment but rigorous conversation that seems somewhat free because we're detached from the subject somewhat. And so we can criticize this author even though she's a feminist, or we can criticize, or we can support this position even though it's from some position we disagree. There's a freedom to criticize bad argumentation without worrying about stepping on toes. But then it's sort of detached, and you can go through it without being changed. So I feel like I've noticed in my experience that it seems like it's difficult to have a classroom where you have a vigorous debate about the merits of arguments and you leave thinking clearly, and you're also invested in the material, and you feel like you're attached to one of the positions or another, that something matters to you about what you
Have you ever played baseball and golf? And when you hit a ball true and you don't even feel it, and it just goes and goes and goes, it's a really rare thing. And I think what you're describing is rarer still. That moment in a class when you as a teacher and your students get to that point in a conversation where people are open and they're listening and they're open to sorts of transformative knowledge, whatever shape it's going to take. But they're also really critical, and they've done the reading, and they see that the stakes in discussing America as an empire are significant. So it feels to me like you might be putting some pressure on yourself when you get to your first job, your first teaching experience. That's going to be, an ideal. It's going to be really hard to get to. Most of our careers, I think, are spent not quite there. With the pop-ups and the bunts and the duck shots that you end up having to work on your recovery.
We're doing the laundry. You know how you feel like you just sports metaphors abound in Justice Theory. Everyone's baseball. It's really interesting because there is something about the craft of teaching. Like some days it just doesn't happen, and even for the best professors, it doesn't. Like they're not doing it. Like they go, well, can't do that again. And I always change out my syllabus in the vain hope that it's going to be perfect every time, and it's really not going to be good. I'm someone who would say something like that. Like I've been known to say, happy schnappy, I don't care if you're happy, who thinks you're supposed to be happy all the time? I mean, I've said that in open classrooms. And I've also said, what you feel is interesting and important to you, but what you argue is the stuff of academic life, right? And I do want people to be able to be scholars, which is different from having a set of passions. And it's a really interesting position because the reason I feel about climate change, sort of panicked and overwhelmed by the drama that we're all about to face as human creatures, is because I listened to the arguments, right? So the arguments convinced me because they were winning arguments, and that's what I want to replicate. I don't want to get up there and just discuss how it makes us feel. That's why I'm a philosopher and not a psychotherapist, right? Because I really don't much care ultimately about how they feel. I want them to, because they're going to feel all sorts of ways. They're going to feel sad all the time.
And undergraduates are really important.
What?
The undergraduates I teach think that their feeling about this is sometimes sacrosanct. I felt that way reading it. And sure, you did, and we can talk about why that is, but we also need to be clear about what the text is saying.
What the text is.
And that is important.
And the text, or the stories you read, the narratives, the text might make you feel wretched, right? Read Holocaust literature, and you're left in a shuddering heap. I'm sure it's the same when you read stories of the
I'm
passage.
teaching a new course, last night was the last day, a course on reparations. And I examined 4 groups of Japanese internment during World War II, Native Americans, having their children placed in foster homes or with white families, Black African American slavery, and Jewish Holocaust. And there are a lot of feelings about that. And I think that on the way to thinking, there may be some feeling, that you might be able to sort of, you might have felt this way, or you're feeling this way, or, even there may be guilt. That's a feeling, right? But the text does help us to sort of unpackage that guilt, to determine, well, where is that coming from and how that might impact how you see reparations for these various atrocities. So I think, I don't have a problem in the classroom with feeling. And the interesting thing is that with teaching, I know I got a PhD and never had a course in how to teach, right? And so that is real. We are kind of thrown into the classrooms, masters of our subject matter, but not necessarily masters at teaching.
So I had a course in how to teach and how to be a professor. It was in your last year before you defended, and the dean of GTU used to teach it. It was like a 1-unit course or something, and you had to learn how to write a syllabus. You had to learn how to interview for a job, how to do a job interview, how to teach the first day of your class, how to teach the last day of your class, right?
Wow.
What to wear to the AAR. Right? It was very specific. It was like what food to bring to the AAR and how you have to, the whole how to be a professor class. And you would do research on your ideal university where you really wanted to teach, like more than anything. we won't say that, but we're.
You won't want to get a course like that.
And get a course, and then you research the university and all the professors in your department, and so you knew everybody's, and that's how you went out for job interviews, right? So you did, and so you replicated that. You knew every single person in the department. You knew all the books that had written their most recent books, and you did your research, and we were taught how to do that.
Right.
AR, black dress, whatever, black suit.
I think I learned being a teaching assistant, a TA and so I was a TA for a couple different professors, but then there was one who I saw myself in, and so I did replicate her mode of, her pedagogy, if you will. But I never took a course on teaching. It's been a sort of trial and error. There have obviously been some mistakes, and not only with syllabus there are mistakes to be made, and you just hope that, I just think it's important to be transparent and open, honest about, just like this course this quarter. We have these courses at DePaul called focal point courses, freshman focal point courses, and so they're about a specific topic. And I told the students first day of class, hey, you know what, this is going to be a ride because this is the first time I'm teaching this. And in many instances, I was one step ahead of them, right? And so I think just being transparent about that, but it's.
I had a really funny experience. My first teaching job was at Texas Christian. I was there just for a year, and my load was 4-3, but the 4 were all the same class in the fall semester. And it was a world religions class, and I had teaching it at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, and then 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And what I learned...
This is like hell.
but it was really educational for me as a teacher, because I learned that it wasn't just me. That yes. I could be very scripted. I could say the same things, make the same points, all the same jokes. And at 10 o'clock, I would slay them and it would go great. And then at 11 o'clock, just be crickets. And then at 1 o'clock, it would be sort of in between. And then 2 o'clock, they were dead and I was dead. It just varied from day to day. So there's space you have to leave space for the students to be the students. And some days they're tired. Sometimes they're in the middle of a rush and they're exhausted. Yeah. That happens to us.
And I always say that classes have personalities just like individuals. I mean, you get a certain mix of people together and it may turn out disastrous. But then again, there are some classes that your personality, it just grooves.
The other thing is, there's a Jewish practice of beginning a class with chocolate. In chocolate, bringing chocolate to your first day. Chocolate to your first day of class. A practice that I believe in. It was an Eastern European, Jewish had a thing. Little boys would go and they would put it on their slates and they would lick it off.
And so what's the purpose of the chocolate? To ingratiate yourself?
This is how Jews in Eastern Europe began learning, and we're going to do it here. I also, I always bring them over to my house. And if it's a big class, I do it in sections. So they have a chance to see a professor's house.
Wow.
And then, to see why I don't have marble in my kitchen, right? Why I have recycled wood in my kitchen. Why I have chickens in the backyard. It's
these are graduate students.
No, these are freshmen. These are undergraduates, and that's part of the deal. Is they know me in my house, and they feed them food that I make. I often bring them on a Jewish religious holiday or Shabbat. If it's during Sukkot, I have a sukkah and I do it. And I don't go around saying, "Look at me, right? I'm an Orthodox Jew." But if you are davening with them in the Hillel Minyan, then there you are. You can't. One of my professor colleagues, wonderful scholar, said to me that his goal, Jewish studies scholar, his goal at the end of his class is for people to think that he's sort of like Protestant, mid-level Calvinist or something. But he wants to really fool them about what he really believes or how he really practices. And I just think that's just a real difference in how you can teach and how you make your claims and something about authenticity. So I think that's an ongoing struggle.
Yeah, it is a struggle because I don't know. I believe in boundaries too. That because sometimes you could get as quote, you know, familiarity breeds contempt.
Well, I don't do it at the beginning of the class. It's very carefully timed. It's timed so we still have about one, maybe two classes to complete. I don't do it, so they're already bonded as a class. They've read each other's papers, with the
Right.
papers. They've heard each other's ideas. But I was, the reason I do it is because when I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore, you went to professors' houses.
Wow.
And I remember thinking how exotic curry was. Right, like, whoa. So,
Wow.
so that made an enormous impression on me. That you model general hospitality.
So do you see your students as peers?
Absolutely not. They're my students. They're my
Okay,
shadow.
okay. Because that's the dilemma, you
No,
know
no,
what I
no,
mean?
no, no.
Because I think that sometimes students...
It's always Professor Zoloth. They never call me by their first name. They always understand that. But it's within, but they do get to come to my house.
One more question, Carmen.
Yeah, I just had a question about sort of the other end of the spectrum, and I think this came up before because Mr. Zoloth had mentioned that sometimes students think that they came up with this stuff. And I think it's relevant actually to your example too about the drawings and things. But I'm wondering, on the production end, how you kind of rein in creativity such that they're attentive to the ways that like in the drawing example, they've been exposed to different images about religion and that they're not making that up and that they didn't come up with the book of whatever. And, you know, like maybe they don't know that that's so mediated, but it is. And also with the text, how they're reading the text, and they're not just going through to cherry pick. They're actually like, sort of reading for understanding and then putting that into a paper. So I'm just wondering, like, on the creative end, how you encourage that, but then also like rein it back in. Some thoughts.
I'm afraid if I start answering, I might answer a question that wasn't asked. Because I don't know how to apply that.
Well, they know they have to be able to do a lit review. A literature review in my class, just like graduate students have to do a lit review for one of your chapters. That's a skill that I tell them, because I say, you're all going to be professors. You're all going to get through your job. And it's a joke, right? But I say that I want you to learn how you do this thing. So that's why I make them do an abstract of their topic for their final paper, so they know what it is to write a 500-word abstract about what they're thinking about. And then write on the plane as they go to the meeting. But I want them to be able to do a literature review. So they'll always assign at least one assignment in which they have to review, usually it's on the midterm, they have to use the arguments of 3 of the 6 people we've read, and they have to summarize their arguments, and then use those arguments to make the case that I've asked, about the question that I've asked them to make. So teaching them how to do a literary review of an article is really an important task for them, and it sobers them up. Because
That's before they pick a topic for their
yes,
final.
that's by the midterm. They're already that's one of the. I have like things I want them to do. Write a paper every week for the midterm to be able to summarize people's arguments, and then by the final, that's when they do an abstract of the topic that they're interested in: refugee crisis in Syria, climate change, American hunger in America, right? Gun violence in Chicago, and then that's when they go out and they have to use. By the way, they have to still use 2 of the authors we've read, secondary sources, and text from at least 3 traditions. So it gives them creativity, but they know about summarizing.
So a lot of it's in the assignment and the structuring of the assignment. And I often tell them, this is a 12-page paper. I'm going to stop reading after 12 pages. You don't have 13 pages. You have 12 pages. And I use the grading scale. If they're being too creative, if they're not arguing from evidence, and then I offer not. So this is all now, as I was mentioning in my comments, the small c craft of teaching. It's a different relationship when I've got the much larger class. And then I have teaching assistants who are engaging with the students, and I try to be really clear about what the parameters of the assignment are, and I keep it short. But I'm not the one who's doing that grading. But I think that the grading scale and engaging students saying that's not what this assignment was about. How you were moved by the text. What I'm asking is
the argument of the text.
Yeah, the argument of the text. How does it compare to the Bhagavad Gita?
Right. Yeah, and so I think too, and I was a little confused about what you meant by reining students in, but I think that structure matters. I mean, when you give students your objectives or grading rubric, they understand exactly what it is you want, and so my syllabus is like it gets longer and longer each time I teach the course because, you take into account, okay, this, that, and the other happened this time. And so I give my students a lot of structure so they understand that, okay, these are the parameters.
I'm even more directive than that. I say, I want a thesis paragraph with your argument in the thesis and 3 examples in which it's played out. And then I want to have a page of each, I teach them a page on each argument, right? That's one of the assignments, right? So they have 3, how can I prove this in 3 ways? Here are 3 examples of my thesis. So it's very like numbers they can remember. I also hand out a 1-page sheet about how to write a term paper, things you're looking for, 1 page with the midterm and with the final exam, so that they have exactly what you want. And then the final thing is, if you end up teaching in a school like Northwestern, everybody's thinks they get straight A's, it's their birthright, they deserve straight A's, they got straight A's in their high school, that's why they're in Northwestern.
Yeah,
Sure,
oh
it's
my
really
God, that's a generation.
That's a generation. They're also special. And so I give them, when they come sobbing into your office because you've given them an A- and not an A, not making it up, I always allow people extra assignments. And that's when I let them be quite creative. I say, go to the newspaper, if I'm teaching a bioethics class, or a class in religious theory, I say, find a story from the newspaper, summarize what the author is saying in the news story, right? And then use one of the authors from our secondary sources, right, to comment on the situation that's described, and then use the third text to think about language that would go toward finding a solution. It's a mini version of the final.
So you're the one who's doing this.
I'm doing
This is awful.
We're not.
This is awful. I have 600 students who are saying
This is me,
I'm
right?
3 points away from an A-. Is there any extra work I can do? And I have to be the jerk who says, no, the course is over.
No, I'm
Creative
the
work
one
for
that
this class
says,
is
if you
over.
really,
Stop it.
really, if you want to go to medical school, like I'm not bored.
But see, we're on quarters.
We're on quarters.
We're on quarters.
Yeah.
And so it's like, quarters can be brutal. So if students just a couple of weeks, they lose, interest and they try to recover. So I believe in extra credit too, I'm sorry to say. And so I give students an opportunity to recover. Some students don't take extra credit.
No.
Extra credit is not mandatory.
No. A lot of them a lot of them, when faced with that, stop whining, wipe their noses across their sleeve and head out. And then and the ones that are desperate to get into medical school write 4,000 with they do a whole thing, and that's okay. They want to work that hard. Okay, right? But they have to work. Just like,
And it's,
I know my graduating, my daughter's
and the
graduating.
extra credit is not easy. It does, in other words, the extra credit fits within the objectives of the
And can I
course.
just, I'd say one thing is, like, frankly, I don't care about grades. I really don't. It's really the worst part of the whole show. It really is. It just is. It's just like and they all really, no one's going to get into TV. A few of them maybe. I've flunked a few students in my career, but it's very rare. They all do like, well, or really well, or exceptional. Right? So we might as, they really are, they're really working hard. They're working their little fingers to the bone. And I feel like there's it's not like I have a box of A's and then a box of B's and C's and I have to like give them out in certain, I'm out of A's, So I had a dean who said to me when I had my first job, I said, they have the points and they've got the numbers, they're all getting A's. And she said, what a good teacher you are. So, her thought was that everybody should be an A student if you're doing your job.
Well, you know what? I've been taught something different, and that is, if all of your students are getting an A, then you're probably too easy. If all of your students are getting Fs, you're probably too hard. That there is a normal distribution where students will kind of fall into. And so, if everyone's getting an A, then I start to wonder, is this not challenging them? Because, in every classroom, it's you got to decide who you're teaching to. Are you teaching to the brilliant students, the mediocre ones, or the not so good ones? So you have to. They don't all come prepacked.
I want to move off from the boring business of grading and back to this idea.
Okay, and I just got one more story about grading. Okay, because this was just, and I said, maybe it's time to retire. because, you know, there's a generational thing too. When I was in undergrad, I had reverence for the teacher. I mean, I can remember one of my most embarrassing moments as an undergrad was running into my professor after I had skipped his class, right? But I have instances where, you know, you have the two classes, there's a student in both classes, they don't make it the first class, and then they come to the second class, and you're like, well, young man, I didn't see you in my first class, and they're looking at you like, you know, that's not your business, you know. But anyway, this student, freshman, in this freshman focal point course, he was not doing well. I have these reading summaries. So they have to, every class period, they have to have a more than two-page summary of the reading. And there are 3 prompts. The first asks, what is the central argument or thesis? And then there's a second problem. Then the third kind of allows that creativity. What do you feel, you know, about the readings overall? And so he said, well, you know what? I'm not getting that first question right. And so what I think you should do is change the point spread, because it was like 2 points, 2 points, 1 point. So he thought that I should make the one that he wasn't doing well on.
With only one. Yeah.
And I was just like, really? And I said, but other students are doing well on it. And so, you know, I thought that was it. Then he writes me an email. And I'm like, what? And so then I had to lay down the law. Listen, I have certain objectives, you know, and, you know, you have to fulfill those objectives or you don't do well in this class. And so what he told me, though, that's why I asked you whether you thought of your students as a peer. Afterwards, after he saw that I was not happy, you know, he's very contrite, and he said, you know, I was just thinking of you as my peer. And I was like, how in the hell would you think of me as your peer? You know, you're a freshman, you just got out of high school, you know? And so how is that even possible? But that sort of entitlement, you know, I want you to change it around for me. It's incredible.
I have in my syllabus that if they're going to write me an email, they can't say, hey, Prof. They have to say, dear Professor Zoloth. That's like part of the deal, like a formal letter of inquiry. And part of it is that you want them to come to office hours too. Very few come unless you stipulate it as part of the story. This is for graduate students. So, okay.
On that note, can we please thank the...
Okay. We're just
a reception in the back. There's wine, food, so please join us. Thank you.
Okay.
You can only stay for 10 minutes. Please do come and grab some food and drink.
Okay.